meantime. Here we go.
Baruch She'amar.
As you can tell from the title, this week we're finally up to Baruch She'amar, perhaps officially the beginning of Sukkot Zimra. I actually noticed that I thought I was being clever, but my title for last week for Hodu was almost exactly the same. I think I called it like Hodu a preface ? Or something like that. So I'm not so clever. I just reused the same bit, but it's the same general question. We'll see. Well, we'll get into it, but the title's not the important part. Don't judge a shiur by its title, you know. So I think 7:05. I think we can start to begin now. So as we left off last time, we talked about Hodu. The first thing we say is part of Sukkot Zimra, and we raised the question: is Hodu the first thing we say is part of Sukkot Zimra, or the last thing we say is part of Korbanot? Because we pointed out that the psukim from Divrei Yamim, the psukim from Chronicles, that Hodu comes from, and putting aside the conclusion of Hodu, which is a few random verses collected from Psalms, but the main part of Hodu comes from a part of Chronicles, a part of Divrei Hayamim there, and there it's being said, as the Aron is being returned from its exile, as David is returning the ark, and sacrifices are being brought. And moreover, the Medrash tells us that this was recited the whole time the Aron was in the tent during the sacrificial offerings. In other words, this is some expression of sacrifices. This is a praise that accompanies sacrifices, and it's part of sacrifices, or really is it an introduction to Sukkot Zimra? So now, having finished that discussion last week, we get to Baruch She'amar, and you must think, well, surely, if last week's discussion was about is this an introduction or not, surely we're at Sukkot Zimra. This must be Sukkot Zimra. We've begun. So yeah, that is true. I don't think anybody says Baruch She'amar isn't part of Sukkot Zimra. But I think we'll see together what role it serves. Is Baruch She'amar an introduction? How exactly do we understand Baruch She'amar? That's what we're going to try and tackle tonight. So, just to begin, as we did last time, we're going to conclude in our activity with perhaps a more in-depth look at the particular verses of Baruch She'amar, give everyone an opportunity to look at the words themselves, translate, and figure out what the meaning means in general into them. But for now, just generally, we're just going to broadly speak about the themes of Baruch She'amar, and the themes of Baruch She'amar are basically as follows. First thing we can point out is that Baruch She'amar is a bracha. It contains the language of Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. That's a blessing. Formal bracha, we're used to that structure. It's a part of our liturgy, part of our prayer. Fine, we're dealing with a bracha. Second thing to know in Baruch She'amar is that the first half of Baruch She'amar is all about God. Blessed is the one who said, let the world be. Blessed is the one who did creation. Blessed is God. Blessed is God. The second half of Baruch She'amar is all about the Jewish people. Those who praise God, who sing God's praise, who contribute to his grandeur. I'm trying to figure out how to verbify the word lahagdil. Those who praise God and make a great name for God, that's what we focus on in the second half. So these two distinct halves, and we have two brachot, two catchphrases of Baruch Atah Hashem. First, we have Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam here. Hakel ha'av rachaman, the God, the Father who is merciful, Hamuhulal, who's praiseworthy, etc., etc. And then we conclude Baruch Atah Hashem machmul b'tishmachot. Blessed are you, who's hulal, who's praised with praise. Great. But what we see is it's a complex bracha. It's a bracha that has two separate blessings, two separate Baruch Atah Hashems. So known as a bracha aruka, a long bracha, or a complex bracha. And that complex bracha really is a turning point in the two different halves. The first half is purely introductory, and it's just about God. Then we have the beginning of the complex bracha, and we turn our focus to the Jewish people's experience of praise, the Jewish people praising God. That's the shift that takes place in Baruch She'amar. So that's just on a very basic level, and we'll all have an opportunity to look at the specific praises that we say for God, and the specific praises that we use for the Jewish people in the future. But so far, so good?
Yeah.
Perfect. We also mentioned last time that the question of when exactly to recite Baruch She'amar has some divergence in different communities. Minhag Ashkenaz and Minhag Sfarad have different understandings of when to say Baruch She'amar. Before Hodu, after Hodu, maybe stick some other things in there first. Hashem Malach, Hashem Malach. All different kinds of stuff, all different verses that ends up over the years getting stuck in there for different customs, different minhagim. Those are a lot less unified because they're a lot later. Sometimes, when we pick random sukkim, some people will pick some random sukkim. Other people will pick other random sukkim. It's not always the same. Every tradition ends up having its own. But when something is picked for a very specific reason very early on, be it by Chazal, by the greatest members of the Great Assembly, or even just Gaonim or early rabbinic figures, but for a very specific reason, that ends up having a little bit more of a prevailing unity or a prevailing history. And there we can start to see a little bit more of exactly what's going on. So Baruch She'amar, fascinatingly, is something that transcends Ol Minhagim. Every Nusach says it, and we'll get a little bit to where it comes from, but every Nusach does it. But it is interesting to note that this is one of those parts of Psukei Zimra, being as it's not just a quote from Psalms, it's actually subject to a lot of different girsa, a lot of different textual variants. So almost every tradition has its own slight textual variant. I quoted here the variant of Sfarad, but even that across different Sfarad communities or Hasidic communities or different communities that might use it otherwise in the Sfarad could change. And if we even look within traditions, if we look at earlier Ashkenazi ones versus later Ashkenazi ones, sometimes things change. In fact, fascinatingly, the minhag used to be that initially Baruch She'amar was only said on Shabbos and holidays. That's the earliest recorded minhag, and we can talk about that. It's a little bit disputed whether that's really true or whether it's just a special version of Baruch She'amar was said. But there's something special was about Baruch She'amar during holidays and Shabbat way back when. And what made it so particularly special was that they had the minhag that every community would add in their own verse for Shabbat or for Yom Tov that was relevant. So it really became this like praise catch-all that started with Psukei Zimra. So it's just interesting always to know when we have these like wildly variant texts that when you look at like Siddur of Amram Gaon, one of the earliest Siddurs we have that has Baruch She'amar, it looks very different from our Siddur, and our Siddur looks different from an Ashkenaz Siddur, and all the different Siddur might look different. So we're dealing with a text that was to some extent alive past a lot of the other parts of Tefillah, and it has two separate segments here: the opening praise, which changes a bit, and the concluding bracha, which is a little bit more stable. Yeah, Richard.
So okay. So what you seem to be saying, and I guess I should have seen this before, is that first of all, pardon the expression, but Baruch She'amar is made up.
So this is a very
right. I mean, this is not David HaMelech. This is not from Psalms. This is a rabbinic creation.
Beautiful. So Richard is raising the point, and this is an important point to ask: where does Baruch She'amar come from? Right? Because if we think about, and our assumption is, and I'm going to springboard here, but I'm going to get back to you, Richard. So don't worry, I'll pass the podium back. But just to get the sources into springboard, if we know, like we saw 2 weeks ago, that there's a mitzvah, there's a rabbinic institution of Psukei Zimra, like the Gemara in Shabbos says over here. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Yechelkim and Gomrei Halal b'chol yom. Rabbi Yossi says, I wish I read Halal every day. Inni, is that true? Amar Mar HaKorei Halal b'chol yom harizeh mecharif megadif. Don't we say that somebody who praises God too much is really a blasphemer, because clearly he doesn't mean it? Kikamiram Psukei Zimra. What he meant was Psukei Zimra, verses of Psalm. So the Gemara establishes from here that there's a rabbinic institution. Is it a mitzvah? Is it good advice? We can discuss why. But there's a rabbinic institution of saying Psukei Zimra, of saying verses of Psalms, which Rashi tells us is Shnei Mizmorim Shel Hilulim. Halul T'Shem N'Shamayim, Halul B'Kodsho. There are two specific verses from the end of Tehillim. And that's our model. Our model for what we're dealing with here is a collection of Tehillim. That's what Psukei Zimra is supposed to be. And if you look past past Baruch She'amar, like Richard's pointing out, everything is from Psalms. Everything there is a Psalm. They're all from Tehillim, and they're all quotes of David, except for, of course, Az Yashir. And that's something we'll discuss together when we get to the end of Psukei Zimra. But for now, we're under the assumption all of this are straight from Psalms. So, given that, what exactly even is Baruch She'amar? That's the question we're dealt with, and where did it come from? So our assumption would be, and then I'll finish this point and I'll open back up to the floor. I'll pass to Richard and then to the floor. Our assumption would be, if Baruch She'amar is a blessing, and it prefaces the mitzvah or the rabbinic institution of Psukei Zimra, what's Baruch She'amar then? It's a blessing. But if Baruch She'amar is a blessing, how are there all these different textual variants of it? Even more than that, who cares about the textual variants? Why is it written in such a way that lends itself for variants? Why is it poetic and long and has all of this like interesting language of blessed is God? That's not how blessings are typically written. Blessings in the very classical rabbinic orientation, they have rules. Blessed are you, God Almighty, who gave us the mitzvah of X. Done. It's a very, very rigid structure. So if we're dealing with this idea that Baruch She'amar is a blessing, how does it have all these variants? That's the question Richard's asking exactly. So, Joel, please, yeah.
Yeah, no, just in general, like I grew up with Nusach Sfard.
Yeah.
And they would tell us that they'd basically say it was superior to Ashkenaz, the Ashkenazi Siddur, because it was because it was more mystical and every word was measured, every single word. But the reality was the main one that, well, most people used, it had all these variations. There were brackets. Some people said this, and sometimes within the brackets there were brackets.
Yeah.
And so it was just confusing. If it was so measured and every single word, why were there all these variations and all the possibilities?
So it's very interesting that Joel's mentioning the Sephardic, or maybe I think that's more Sephardic than Sfarad, or maybe more mystical.
Polish Sfard, we called it.
Yeah. The mystical tradition of that the numerology and the specific number in every individual word matters. That's for sure a major part of Tefillah. And what's really fascinating is, while that stuff usually is rooted more in like post Arizal, post Leeadic, like pretty recent Jewish texts, and maybe even incorporates some outside thought, in the world of Tefillah, that's actually extremely core and fundamental. For some reason, all the Rishonim and all the halachic texts even, they incorporate Kabbalah and specifically numerology, so much so that for some reason I can tell you, Baruch Shemar is supposed to have 87 words corresponding to Rosho Ketem Paz. That its Rosh, its opening, its beginning is Ketem Paz, a stain of this, like, I guess Paz is some sort of like nice oil or scent or something. It's a nice thing. So all of the Torah quotes going from Rishonim already, that there's supposed to be 87 words in Baruch She'amar, and that's important because it parallels Rosho Ketem Paz. So already we see this idea that there's some significance to the numerology, the word count here. Also, I'd say more significant for the lens that we're looking at Baruch She'amar specifically. You point out that the numerology is so important. Why do they want Baruch She'amar to have 87 letters? So that it corresponds to a verse, a phrase about being the Rosh, about being the introduction. Because Baruch She'amar is an introduction. It's the Rosh, it's the opening, the head, the beginning of Psuki de Zimra. So Rosh Ketem Paz, we have this beautiful introduction to Psuki de Zimra. So all that takes us back to, if we have this beautiful introduction to Psuki de Zimra, and we're going to assume that we're dealing with a bracha, we see, for example, the Rif here. The Rif on brachot says, Tiknu Rabbanan Lemimra bracha mekmehu bracha mevatzraihu. The rabbis established, it's a bracha, it's a blessing, a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, to say a bracha before and after Psuki de Zimra. Umay nihu, and what is this? Baruch She'amar v'yishtabach, Baruch She'amar. That's a blessing before Psuki de Zimra that the rabbis established like any other mitzvah. But we pointed out, if that's the case, it's a very strange blessing. It's long, it has textual variants, it praises God a bunch. But what is going on with this blessing? It's so weird. So that's something I want to explore. Is Baruch She'amar a blessing recited before or on the Psuki de Zimra, a birchat ha-mitzvah, a blessing on a mitzvah we recite before and after we do a mitzvah? Or are we dealing with something else here? That's the question I want to put forward. So just to establish firmly the majority opinion, the perhaps more explicitly halachic opinion here, we have the Shibbolei Halakhet paralleling the words of the Rif. We know the Rif lived in northern Africa, in Al-Andalus, as was known. The region of Al-Andalus is actually a very significant region. I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Al-Andalus means like the treasure, because it was like this very fertile like crescent between northern Africa and like southern Spain. And I think that's the general region where the Rif lived, Rambam lived, all these major, like really important, like the early authorities. Anyways.
Leead,
yeah.
Andalusia is in Spain.
Yeah. But
it's not. Northern Africa. Africa is Africa, and Spain is Spain. And
okay.
We have Gibraltar to make the distinction.
Okay, fine. There's no crossover during that period. There's clearly okay, fine.
No, not at all. I mean, I think Andalus is in Spain. In fact, it's probably northern Spain near the Pyrenees. But anyway, it's Andalusia.
No, it's mistake. Andalus is southern Spain.
From southern. Okay.
From Seville down south.
Okay. Good.
And
okay,
the Rif may have been from Andalus, but spent most of his life
in
northern Africa, and it was the place that they escaped to because of Muslim persecution. The same as the Rambam, who was also
to this day.
But Andalus is definitely Spain.
Sorry, I presented it poorly. Yeah, part of the Andalusian tradition of southern Spain. A lot of crossover between that tradition and Northern Africa, because like saying the expulsion led to a lot of Jews, like Rambam, or really like the Rambam and the Rif for different times and for different reasons, but a similar trajectory of fleeing the Andalusia area to Northern Africa. So I wasn't making a geographic claim, I was making a traditional claim in terms of the tradition of like Andalus or Andalusian tradition southern Spain to northern Africa is in the same tradition. All that is just to say, it's interesting history and important history, but it's also to say it's not surprising that Rambam follows in the tradition of the Rif, because Rambam and the Rif are part of the same cultural, geographic, social, halachic tradition, and that's usually what we expect with known, famous divergences that exist. But what's interesting is that Shibbolei HaLeket, a very early Ashkenazic authority, and later what ends up being in the Ashkenazic majority, similarly goes in this approach and takes the position of the Rif to its logical extreme, takes it to a complete halachic extreme. So if we look in source 5, the Shibbolei HaLeket here, a very early Germanic Ashkenaz source now in the 13th century, he establishes a similar halacha to the Rif and says as follows: Tiknu chachamim bracha lefnehem u'bracha la'achreihem. According to the Rif, the rabbis established you should say a blessing before and after Pesukei Zimra. Lefnehem baruch shamar, beforehand you say baruch shamar. La'achrein yishtabach, and we'll get to yishtabach when we get there. Halamata sha'asur lahafsik u'ledaber mishiyitchilu baruch shamar ad shechote mechazan yishtabach. You should learn from here that it's forbidden to make a interruption and to speak from the moment you start Baruch Shamar until the time you finish Yishtabach. In other words, says the Shibbolei HaLeket, if we're really dealing with a bracha, a birchat ha-mitzvah, and we have a unit with a blessing beforehand and a blessing afterhand, well, we know the rules. You're not allowed to interrupt a blessing. You can't talk. So therefore, here you shouldn't be allowed to talk either during Pesukei Zimra. So we see very early on, Baruch Shamar is being taken so literally as a bracha. It's being taken as the boundary of when you can no longer talk. That's when it's now halachically a hefsek. V'chein matzati b'shem Rabbeinu Shlomo Zatzal. Rashi also held this way. Kol hatzibor rashai lomar yishtabach b'fihem k'mo she'omer baruch shamar. El shenogu she'omer otan achadza b'mida v'onen acharav amen. U'miyad matchil hakadosh k'derech she'omer kadosh l'apsukim. Apparently, there was a bit of a discussion or a question in the early days of Baruch Shamar, whether it could be recited by individuals. And presumably the stakes of reciting it as an individual is it an individual mitzvah? Is it just part of the congregational prayer that when we all get together we'll say it? Or is it something that an individual says? So says the Shibbolei HaLeket, he found a writing from Rashi that says it's an individual prayer that happens to be said aloud together in shul because not everybody knows it. But it's still fundamentally an individual prayer, and any individual can say it. Based off of that, the Shibbolei HaLeket is saying this is indication that what we're dealing with here is a blessing before the mitzvah of Pesukei Zimra that applies to everybody. So he says, so he brings Rashi as a further indication. We're really dealing with here is a blessing on Pesukei Zimra. And now we see multiple halachic expressions of this question. One expression of it, the question is whether or not you can say it aloud on your own, whether or not you can say it on your own, or whether you only say it b'tzibor with a congregation, whether it's just part of the communal praise to God. That's one question. Do I say it on my own, or is it only communal?
So let me just ask you. Okay.
Sure.
If you're raising an issue of maybe I shouldn't be saying it, this bracha and what's in between, because what's in between is a divrei kedusha, similar to the kedusha that we've already had kind of like this discussion, right?
Yeah.
And different people are poskening, right, as to things like kadosh, 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 etc. Maybe only should be said in a minyan because it's divrei kedusha, right? Or in fact, no, we're just simply quoting. So is this being questioned and put into that kind of category?
So that's a good question. I'm not sure if he's going so far as to say it's actually divrei kedusha. My read was he's saying it's just words of praise. And words of praise are best said when you have the option out loud together. We know.
Of course, best is, but best is different than only.
Okay, so that's a good point. You could take this really like very strictly and say he's not saying like what one should do. He's saying like you literally don't have the option. Like it's usser, and then it would be much more similar to how you're reading it. So that's a good point. I think it's a little ambiguous. I think it's ambiguous if what he's saying here is Rashi was rejecting an opinion that said it was usser, forbidden to ever recite it on your own, or merely that the preferable way to act is when you get to shul, let the chazan say it and then don't recite it on your own. So that's a good point. But for sure, what we see is some sort of counter pressure that somehow the ability to say it on your own indicates that really we're dealing with a bracha. That we can quibble about how to understand that. I think it's not a quibble. I think it's actually like an important halachic discussion we're not going into here. So thanks for raising it. But for sure, what we see is that connection being established in Rashi. So that's one halakhic ramification. Another more agreed upon halakhic ramification: you can't talk or interrupt during this period. It's a unit. So we can all agree that that makes a lot of sense. All right. So far so good. But the minhag developed that the chazan says it's standing and everyone else says amen. And then after Yishtabach, you say Kaddish, just like we always say Kaddish after we quote a verse from the Torah, after we learn Torah together. It's not appropriate or fit to stop or to interrupt for any manner between Psuki de Zimra, as kicked off by Baruch Shamar, and Yishtabach. Because if you do stop, and then you say God's praise, it's as if your blessing is livatala, is nullified. So I think it's open for interpretation here. Does he just mean in general it's a bracha livatala because there's a hefsek and interruptions, disqualify your unit? Or does he mean even more specifically, if you're going to talk about other things, it somehow undermines the praise you're saying for God? You're in the middle of praising God, and before you even finish the unit, you turn to somebody else or some other matter and talk, and a little bit undermines your praise. So I think that's a little bit open for interpretation here. But either way, it's mevarich levatala. Whether it's a general bracha levatala, specific here because of the nature of the bracha we're reciting here, it's a bracha levatala, it doesn't count. Uberchat yishtabach achar psuki de zimra kiberchat halal la'acharav. And here, the Shibbolei Eleket gives his most extreme formulation. He says the bracha of yishtabach is parallel to the bracha of halal. Uberchat baruch shemar kiberchat halal lefanav. And baruch shemar is parallel to the blessing recited before halal. Now, the great irony, of course, is that when we turn to the halal, what is the bracha that we recite before reciting the halal? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kishem tzivanu. Blessed are you, God, who commanded us lekro et halal, to read the halal. A typical formulation for birchat hamitzvah, a blessing recited before a mitzvah, a ritual act. Now, what's the blessing that we say at the end of halal? We recite all these praises of Hashem. Ya'alucha Hashem, you're so praiseworthy, you're so great. Kimi olamad olamad takel, you're forever the God. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are Hashem, melech v'hula b'tishbachot, the king who is praised in its praise. So, according to the Shibbolei Eleket, the last bracha parallels Yishtabach, and the first bracha parallels Baruch Shamar. But in reality, the last bracha, melech v'hula b'tishbachot, is literally the identical bracha to Baruch Shamar. Baruch atah Hashem melech v'hula b'tishbachot. And the first bracha, which is a birchat mitzvah, is highly controversial. Is that what we're dealing with here? Is this a birchat mitzvah? Doesn't seem like it if you look at the textual parallel. This looks nothing like the bracha we recite before Hallel. So sort of ironically, by trying to make his argument and quote the bracha of Hallel as a parallel, he highlights how strange it is to claim that Baruch Shemar is doing the same thing as the blessing we do before Hallel. Why isn't it shortened to the point? So the Shibbolei Eleket clearly takes the approach of the Rif and runs with it, having halachic ramifications from it, making this strong parallel to Hallel, but he takes it so far that it's a little bit challenging. So that's our first approach here. Approach number one that seems to be the majoritarian approach, and that is that what we're dealing with here is a bracha recited before the Psuki de Zimra.
There is the distinction between, though, Hallel is said is said only, quote, on special occasions, whereas Baruch Shamar and Psuki Zimra are said daily. So you could imagine that you would love to see them follow the same model of brachas. On the other hand, one is simply something that's every single day, right? And including holidays and Shabbos, et cetera, right? Whereas Hallel is this singular event that on special events, we have this encapsulated praising of God.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, you're also highlighting, at least to me, that, and it's a great point, that the earliest recorded minhag of only reciting Baruch Shamar on Shabbos and Yom Tov works really well with this parallel. Because Hallel also, it was something you recited on holidays. Mm-hmm. So fine, Baruch Shamar got out of hand, and now we say it every day. But the parallel actually works pretty well here if you think of it that way. Like, what is this? It's a blessing we recite before we do our holiday mitzvah of praising God, just like Hallel. Okay, so this includes Shabbos? All right, it's a little more inclusive. But it's like a similar model. Then it gets out of hand, we recite it every day. But it's a good point. It's a strong parallel in that regard. So there's weaknesses, but there's also strengths here. Fair enough.
But it just say, in terms of the parallel, we end Hallel with Melech Mehulo Batishbachot, but we don't end Yishtabach with that form, those words. But we do end the bifurcated Baruch She'amar prayer with Melech Mechulo Batishbachot. So there's something dysfunctional about this comparison.
Exactly. Beautiful. Somehow, whatever we accomplish at the end of Hallel is what we accomplish at the beginning with Baruch She'amar.
Yeah.
So something's confusing there. Perfect. Exactly. So I want to get to that, and hopefully we'll have some sort of theory that can address that. No promises. But for now, let's operate within this majority approach. For now, we have the approach, given its weaknesses, given the struggle, that Baruch She'amar is a bracha, Yishtabach is the concluding bracha, and Psukei D'Zimra is the filler in the middle. Now, of course, if that's the case, and Baruch She'amar is a bracha, one of the biggest challenges we raise is the text of it. The text is really strange. Now, why is the text so strange? Why don't we have a simple, unified Baruch She'amar? Where does Baruch She'amar come from? So this is a great question. You would think, where do all the other brachas, literally every other blessing in the Siddur, come from? The rabbis somewhere. Usually the Gemara, but sometimes it might be an obscure midrash, sometimes some other rabbinic canon, but the rabbis. It all comes from the rabbis. Fine. But what about Baruch She'amar? Doesn't appear anywhere in rabbinic literature. Now, many of the phrases do. V'haya ha'olam, that's a midrash. That's a quote of a midrash, the one who said, let the world be. All kinds of phrases from Baruch She'amar do have rabbinic either origins or tones, but Baruch She'amar itself is not recorded anywhere in the rabbinic literature. So much so that we see the Pri Chadash, for example, in the 17th century here, commenting on the Shulchan on the Torah. The Pri Chadash says, Timani, I'm surprised, I'm amazed. Ma'achar shenistam v'nichtam Talmud. Once the Gemara was sealed, Eich yechlu ha'gaonim l'takin berachot mechudashot. How did the Gaonim, how did these later rabbis make up a new bracha of Baruch She'amar? What? Where does this come from? It's nowhere in the Gemara. And this is one of the most puzzling questions for all of Baruch She'amar that I will not have a good answer for you. I'm not going to give you a definitive answer. Where does Baruch She'amar come from? That's the question put forth. It doesn't appear anywhere in the Gemara. So,
well, one answer you just given is it's clearly late. It's post-Talmudic.
Perfect.
Is that reasonable?
Yeah, exactly. So you'll see the Pri Chadash's assumption, and Richard's reflecting this, is that it's post-Talmudic. And not just that, the Pri Chadash's assumption is it's immediately post-Talmudic. It's Gaonic. That Eich Yechlu Gaonim. How could the Gaonim do this? Now, of course, as we mentioned in passing, of course, it must be at least Gaonic, because we know the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon mentions it. So Rav Amram Gaon was a bit of a later Gaon, so it could be late Gaonic, it could be towards the end of the Gaonic period, but nonetheless, it's Gaonic. So it's a good point he's identifying with that, but that's also because we know that the earliest recorded tradition we do have is the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon. But it's definitely, he's identifying it post-Talmudic, and that could be an assumption. But what is for sure is that it's not recorded in the Talmud. But what is interesting is, despite the lack of a record in the Talmud, we do have some Rishonim who try to force it in there a little bit. So, for example, if you look at the Mordechai, as we've mentioned before, the Mordechai was an early, I guess, aggregate, not really compendium, because unlike the Rambam and others, he didn't reorganize so well, but aggregate of Ashkenazic Psak, of Ashkenazic Halacha, which unfortunately, Ashkenazic Halacha in general, much of it was lost and destroyed during pogroms, and the Mordechai, much of it was lost and destroyed. So this is our fragment of a fragment. But the Mordechai tells us as follows, in the end of Psachim, he has a general reflection on Hilchos Pesach, and he talks about Hallel. And talking about Hallel, of course, he ends up talking about Psukei D'Zimra. So he tells us at the end of Psachim, the Mordechai says, Sivu alav lomar bo Hallel gadol, birchat shir nishma kolchai, shetiknu anshe knesset hagadol. So he says, what are we commanded to recite as part of the Hallel that we say at the Seder? We're commanded to recite the large Hallel that we say every morning at Shachris, that the Anshe Knesset Hagdola established, that the members of the Great Assembly established. So what's interesting here is that the Mordechai is identifying the establishment of Psukei D'Zimra, not to the rabbis, but actually to earlier than the rabbis, to earlier than the Talmud, all the way back to the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. And based on that, many Achronim say that, maybe according to the Mordechai, maybe one could say that there's a claim here that the Anshe Knesset Hagdola wrote Baruch She'amar too. If they wrote Psukei D'Zimra, and Baruch She'amar is the beginning of Psukei D'Zimra, and we don't know where it comes from, it comes from the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. That's the claim that people say. I don't even think it's so convincing in the Mordechai. He doesn't mention Baruch Shamar, and we don't say Baruch Shamar at the Seder. Do we? I'm not wrong on that, right?
No.
No, we don't say Baruch Shamar at the Seder. Okay, that's what I thought. So we don't say Baruch Shamar at the Seder.
There's a tradition, and I heard this from an Orthodox rabbi, of all things. There is a tradition that Nishmat was written by Peter. That, I mean, there's a whole story. I don't remember it exactly. The rabbi sent Peter to spy on the Christians. He was really, and then
this whole story.
Pardon?
Unfortunately, unfortunately, I've heard this whole story, but I don't remember it well enough to recount it.
Yeah, it's quite involved. But
this is like, it's like a thing. It's like a thing that's like recorded. It's not like a conspiracy. I mean, maybe it is a conspiracy theory, so I shouldn't spread it without checking. But like, it's a thing that people have written about. So we can. I'm gonna look into it. We'll have a share about this one day. Thanks for raising that, Joel. Yeah, but what we do see is fine. So 1 week.
Beautiful prayer.
Yeah. So one week theory they put forth though is that Anshe Knesset Gedolah, maybe they also wrote Nishmat. They wrote a whole bunch of stuff. Fine. Not so strong. I don't even think the Mordechai himself says that because we don't even say Baruch Shamar the Seder. Yeah, Jeremy, I see you raising your hand, please.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering, does it matter? You know, do we have to tie it back to the Talmud?
This is very
good.
good.
The prayers that we say now, for example, Tefillah L'Shalom Medinat Yisrael, certainly, you know, it's like if people tried to invent that connection to the Talmud for that, you know, good luck. You know, and it doesn't delegitimize the prayer. Or are some people saying it does?
So Jeremy is raising, and this is such an important issue in the sugya. Who cares? Why does it matter the origin? If it's a beautiful prayer, it's a beautiful prayer. So I think this is actually hitting on exactly the heart of the sugya. Because what's our claim right now? Our claim is that this isn't just part of the praise of God, but specifically it's a birkat ha-mitzvah with all the trappings of rabbinic institution. So once that's the case, it makes sense now. All of a sudden we have all these achronim, and maybe even this is what the Rishonim themselves are getting at, these earlier authorities, saying, oh no, where do the rabbis say this if this is a rabbinic institution? But things like Bracha L'Shalom Medina, things that are purely praise, purely liturgical, those don't need any rabbinic trappings. So there we would say, who cares? Wherever it came from, it came from. In other words, you're raising the very fact that one of the major questions in the sugya, one of the major things that people focus on so much is who wrote this? Where did it come from? It's pointing out that we're struggling with viewing this as a bracha. What kind of blessing has this form, has this text? What kind of blessing doesn't appear this way? So you're touching on a really important point specifically within the world of brachot. Now, with regards to the broader question of liturgy, you're also touching on a really good point. And I just want to mention this in passing because I do think it comes up a lot.
Leead, before you go on,
the
notion of where it comes from, its halachic status, while an interesting philosophical or academic issue, it also then plays out on, okay, I got to catch a plane.
For sure, exactly. Making it.
What can I leave, or what can I shorten? What can I abbreviate, or what I must absolutely say? I mean, it has to do with levels of hiyuvim that really does apply to one's everyday life in any number of circumstances.
Exactly. How we perceive the point of Baruch She'amar will color what we think its halachic status is. Because if the point of it is to preface the Psukei Zimra, then it's a birkat mitzvah. So therefore, any evidence we have of the point of Baruch She'amar will in turn serve as evidence for whether we were dealing with a bracha here. And then that'll touch upon our question of if it's a bracha, why is the text unlike every single other bracha? So I think specifically in the narrow question of brachot, of rabbinic instituted blessings recited before mitzvot, that's exactly what we're hitting on here, that everyone cares because that's what people are thinking about Baruch She'amar. More broadly, there's actually a very interesting discussion that takes place surrounding liturgy, whether liturgy should be based in the rabbis, or whether, no, it's okay that liturgy is living and it changes and it develops. So famously, the Vilna Gaon, and then later more contemporarily for us, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the Rav, and his students, were of the opinion that liturgy is really historically or traditionally more focused. It's not as alive as it's meant to be. And you should be looking towards the rabbis as official codifiers of liturgy. So there's all kinds of changes they make because of that. So for example, in benching, we say, Bonei Barachamav Yerushalayim. But the Talmud says Bonei Yerushalayim. Never said the word Barachamav. So the Vilna Gaon and the Rav leave out the word barachamav because we can't add words that the Talmud didn't say. And they do this all over, all throughout davening, throughout benching, throughout blessings, etc. Whenever there's something quoted in the Talmud or in a rabbinic teaching, if it's quoted there, then that's the way we have to say it. This also comes up in all different kinds of things people don't even necessarily realize. That's why they do it. Some people have the minhag to say yitkadel v'yitzkadesh or yiskadel v'yiskadesh. That's because the way it appears in the Bible is in the formulation of yitkadel, even though maybe technically in modern Hebrew, yitkadal would be equally good, equally sufficient. But again, this idea of preserving the most authoritative sense of the text, that's a value that the Gra, the Rav, and some people have, some textual traditionalists you might call them have, and therefore they don't want to diverge from our earliest record of how the text was recorded. So that's a separate discussion, but it's a good opportunity just to raise that point that, like, personally, I more or less have adopted the approach of the Vilna Gaon in my personal prayers. So, like, it's personally meaningful because I also sort of leave out things that don't appear in the Gemara, and we can discuss why that is another time, a broader philosophical reflection on it, because there's lots to discuss. But this is just another expression, another example, perhaps, of the question of when does it matter where it came from, why do we need the rabbinic stamp of approval? But what we see here is we have this sort of weak hint in the Mordechai, the Budraham, in 14th century Seville, 100 years later, less than 100 years later, in the 14th century, the Budraham similarly tries to conceptualize or justify or explain how what we're dealing with here really is a bracha, and nonetheless it has a strange formulation. So it says the Budraham, O nearly tam acher, the fishat kanat hachamim likrod zmirot shebesov tilim, levarch lefneim barach shamar lachem barach yishtabach, the ein lahosef in time is more machirim. So the Budraham just asserts that it appears to him that it's a Takana Chachamim, a decree of the rabbis, a rabbinic institution, a mitzvah derabanan, to say a blessing of Baruch Shemar before you recite the Tehillim, before you recite the Psalms, as part of the Psuchas Zimra. So says the Budraham, just a mitzvah derabanan. He has no proof. He doesn't try to cite proof. He doesn't refer to a Gemara, to any rabbinic text, but he asserts it, and we understand the urge to assert it. It solves a lot of our problems. Fascinatingly, perhaps the most famous answer is the answer of the Or Zarua, brought here in the name of the Mishnah Brura, because I think this is why it's the most famous answer, because it's quoted in the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura quotes Or Zarua gives the following amazing solution to where the bracha comes from. Shevach zeh taknuhu anshe knesset gdola. The members of the Great Assembly established this. Ayedei pitka denafam and shemayim. From a petek, a post-it, a note that fell down from the sky, from the heavens. Matzu katov bo, and Baruch Shemar was written on it. That's the solution of the Mishnah Brura. A piece of paper fell from the heavens, and this beautiful prayer was on it, and an Anshe Knesset Gdola said we have to integrate this into our Tefillah. So we can talk about what that would mean in terms of whether or not it's a bracha or not. I'll note that he does say identify it with Anshe Knesset Gdola, like the Mordechai, so it is pretty early, pretty authoritative. I think it's just a beautiful idea. I don't know if we necessarily have to worry ourselves so much about the historical claim of it, but Baruch Shemar is of mysterious origin, and one approach is just embracing it and saying, good, it fell from the sky, beautiful. But what we do see is if it's a bracha, we have this sort of difficulty in that its origin and its authorship is sort of strange. Yeah, please, Richard, I see you raising your hand.
So whenever I hear a rabbinic source trying to attribute something to the Anshe Knesset Gadola, I'm always suspicious, mainly probably because of a couple of lectures I've listened to and saying that we simply, at least meaning in modern scholarship, have no idea what they could be possibly talking about in terms of something concrete in the world. So that's one problem. But now that I hear that a parchment has fallen out of heaven, I can only respond that this sounds like, and I don't know whether it's Italian or whether it's Latin, a deus ex machina.
Definitely Latin, and it is.
Okay. I mean, okay, very nice, very poetic, but really, come on, this is really almost now moving over into the realm of theater.
Oh, beautiful. So I would say, and I'll point out, that this is one of the things I learned from Rav Rosenzweig, one of my Rebbeim. Whenever a Rishon or a rabbi or a halachic authority says something that seems like a really big stretch, you should probably assume they weren't dumb. But what it does indicate to you is the ulterior motives or the stakes at play that they're compelled to make such a weak claim.
Yes. Okay.
Why do we have to make this ridiculous claim? Because if we're committing to the idea of Baruch Shemar as a bracha, as a blessing, then we have to somehow defend how its text is so divergent. Right. And the most extreme example is what we ultimately end up with. This beautiful midrash or poem, this homily that it fell from the sky. But we all know that's not a literal claim of history, but we're forced to say it because of the trouble of perceiving it as a bracha.
Okay.
So all that's to bring us to source number 8, once again to the Torah. So I think maybe the second out of 3 weeks that the Torah is going to open up our sugya. But the Torah here has a slightly different perception of what's going on in Baruch She'amar that I want to focus on. The Torah says, Tzarich la'omro bin nigun ubin ne'ima. You have to say Baruch She'amar in song and pleasantly. Ki hu shir na'eh v'nichmad. Because it's a beautiful song. Says the Torah, Baruch She'amar is not just a birchat ha-mitzvah, but it's a song of praise. It's a song of praise of God. And therefore, you have to sing it like a song of praise. Beautiful idea, and perhaps more interesting even, if you take the Torah's idea just in broader context. We're about to say our praise to God. We know our praise to God is Tehillim, the specifically bound, historical, codified, biblical source of praise. But it's an interesting, beautiful idea that we open it with a song of praise that was written later, that's more contemporaneous, that we sing, that we imbue life in. That's how we preface our later appeal to the historical, traditional songs of praise. I think it's a very beautiful idea. So this idea that we should be singing Baruch She'amar, though, in addition to just generally moving and beautiful, it highlights a tradition of Baruch She'amar that views it less as a formalistic blessing on a mitzvah, but more as just a living part of the praise of Psukei de Zimra. And just to highlight this, there's the Nativ Bina, that I like to quote from time to time, the sefer on the historical progression of halacha. So Rabbi Yisachar Yaakov in the Nativ Bina quotes a couple of historical incidents I think really highlight this. So for example, just reading the English here, Rabbi Abraham Berliner, in his German book, The Lives of German Jews in the Middle Ages, comments, it's told of Rebbe Shimon, the author of the book Baruch She'amar, that every day of his youth he was known to pray this blessing with a particularly pleasant tune, and because of that he got the nickname Baruch She'amar, and that's why he named his book that. Oh. And Y.L. Zunz, I would assume Leopold Zunz, but I'm not sure, Y.L. Zunz writes in his book that in the community of Regensburg, Germany, Baruch She'amar took a full hour to recite. That'd be very convenient while we're stalling for Mordechai. Y. Albogen in his book adds further that Rebbe Israel Isserlin, the Trumas Hadeshen, had the custom in Marburg and Steiermark that the recitation of Baruch She'amar should take an hour between Elul and Yom Kippur. Very interesting. So first of all, just fascinating this idea that it's sung and drawn out, and that's a value. It takes an hour. Also interesting this idea that Davka during Yom Kippur starting Mei Tshuva time, that's when we should focus on it. But we see that there's this whole other tradition, this whole other perspective, mainly Ashkenaz, mainly found in these German communities. The Baruch She'amar is not just a rigid blessing, but actually it's this contemporaneous, capricious expression of the moment, a beautiful song of praise of God. And to embody that, you should be singing when you recite it. And just to highlight that this isn't just a slightly different perspective, but again, this is a totally different conceptualization of what we're dealing with. I want to highlight a point raised by the Bach. The Bayit Chadash, the Bach on the Torah, points out, Masha Kasha, it's difficult. Lama lo katav Rabbeinu tzarach sheyomer Baruch She'amar ba'amida. Why doesn't the Torah say you have to say Baruch She'amar standing? And you'll note that the Torah doesn't mention that anywhere, even though ultimately the Shulchan Aruch does, Rambam does, the Halacha, as you say, it's standing, doesn't make it into the Torah. But I think part of the idea for the Torah is that it's not halachically required that you stand. It's not a birchat ha-mitzvah like we announced. Everybody stand for the bracha on the Megillah. Everybody stand for this bracha. It's not sure you stand because you're so full of life and song from singing Baruch She'amar. If you're not full of that life and song, if you don't want to stand, if you want to sit, fine, so sit. You're missing the purpose, though. The standing isn't a formalized ritual standing. It's a lived experience of standing and of song. So what we have is a totally different conception of Baruch She'amar. Now, on the one hand, we have the rigid sense of Baruch She'amar as a birchat ha-mitzvah, as a blessing on the mitzvah. We find that rooted in the earliest halachic codifiers, in the Rif, in the Rambam, and then in early Ashkenazic halachic sources. But on the other hand, we have later developed a sense of Baruch She'amar that explains the poetic nature of it. That we're not just dealing with a rigid birchat ha-mitzvah, but we're really expressing praise for God, and we're embodying that praise in a currently living and soulful song. So I think it's a beautiful idea, one that maybe we could incorporate more. I'm not the singer, so I'll leave it to the singers to figure out how. But gives us a different perspective of what Baruch She'amar is doing here. Then again, methodologically, as we've been doing often, we see that we have 2 or 3 different perspectives laid into the text. And experientially, that gives us the opportunity to incorporate a more lively, perhaps a more soulful experience to our Baruch She'amar going forward.
Can I just ask, has anyone ever heard anyone sing the full Baruch She'amar?
So this is a good question. I was going to ask this too. When I grew up in day school, we learned like a chant. We didn't learn a song. I don't know if people heard like Baruch She'emar V'Haya Ha'olam Baruch Hu. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but we learned like a chant. But I was wondering, it's a good question. Like, it's so strange that there's like a story tradition of song. There's like no tunes for it.
Kindergarten, but in the shul, I have never heard it.
Yeah, especially because if you think about it, like 13th to 14th century Germany, that's like where a lot of our tunes come from. Like that's a right tune time. Like you'd think, yeah, for sure we'd have a tune. So yeah, it's a good question. Maybe some Hasidic communities do. That'd be something interesting to look into. I tried to find if I could, like, there's some sticky videos of like Hasidim who take like an hour to recite the Shema. So I tried to find if I could find one for Baruch Shemar, but I couldn't find one. But we all get the idea. We understand how it could be sung. But yeah, if anyone comes across a tune, let me know. But that transitions us now to our activity. And thankfully, Rav Dov has an activity specifically centered on Baruch Shemar. So we're going to be reading on page 50 now in the Rav Dov book, Prepare My Prayer. So on page 50 here, Rav Dov says as follows, Ilu finu male shira kiyam, if our mouths were as full of song as the sea, and our tongue with jubilation as his myriad waves, if our lips were full of praise like the spacious heavens, and our eyes shone like the sun and moon, if our hands were outstretched like eagles of the sky, and our feet as swift as hinds. Still, we cannot thank you enough, Lord, our God and God of our ancestors, or bless your name, for even one of the thousands and myriads of favors you did for our ancestors and for us. Translation of Nishmat Kochai. So we haven't gotten there yet, but sets the tone. So Rav Dov writes, I look around me. The world is full of stars and the solar system, and the wonders of nature and technology, and incredible people. Wow, it is incredible what is happening here. What a wondrous world. Praise is the movement of amazement, of awe. Opening the eyes to the wonder of creation, I pray, and I sing, I extol and I say, and my mouth is full of song. I am flooded. My emotions overflow. Wow, you are worthy of praise. So now we're going to do the activity together. So first, just as a preface before I read the activity, I think it's a good opportunity as the activity centers on Baruch Shemar, and we'll see that. I'll read the activity and we'll all have time to do it. But when I give us all time to read the activity, I think it might be helpful if we first take a moment just to look over Baruch Shemar. Just look it over, look at the translation, understand the contents of it, and that will be helpful for the following activity. In order to fill ourselves with a feeling of praise, we'll use the structure of the traditional prayer Baruch Shemar, blessed is the one who spoke. Beginning with the first line of the prayer, say, blessed is the one who spoke, and the world came to be, blessed is the one. And we add to this additional expressions of praise. Blessed is the one who, whatever. For example, blessed is the one who created the wondrous human body. Blessed is the one who created such a beautiful world. Blessed is the one who fashioned the human mind. So Rav Dov from there recommends that a group should get together outside, go off in a forest, look around, take in the beautiful scenes, and then write their own blessed is the one who and share them. Unfortunately, we can't do that together. But I think what we can do is we can all take a moment to read some of the Baruch She'emar, some of the blessed is the ones that are in the Siddur, to get a sense, get some ideas going as to the type of praise we can give God. Then maybe we can take a nice 30 seconds, close our eyes, stop, just take a moment of separation, look around our room for something maybe we don't appreciate or we aren't thankful for, and then write a Baruch She'emar, write a blessed is the one for it, and we'll all get back together and let's say, times it now, let's say we'll all get back together in 4 minutes at 7:56, and we'll all share a Baruch She'emars together. Blessed is the one who. So about 3 or 4 minutes to look around, to read over Baruch Shemar, take a moment, look around your room, find a couple things that you want to praise God for, write it in the Baruch Shemar structure, and then we'll all get together and share one of them. So I'll stop the screen. Oh, actually, I'll keep the screen share. My bad, because I'll keep up Baruch Shemar. Perfect. And we'll give everyone some time. Give everybody one more minute, and then we'll come back together. Right, come back together. If you're still working, feel free to take another moment. But does anyone want to volunteer to go first to share their Baruch She'amar, their Blessed is the One? Don't everyone volunteer at once. If no one wants to go first, I'm happy to go first. Joel, please. Joel, you're muted. I'm sorry. I can't hear you.
I didn't write it down, but I have it in my head.
Perfect.
Blessed is God who's given people the seichel, like the how do you say seichel in English? The reasoning power, more or less, to God gave people the reasoning ability and the intelligence to create new and better vaccines that are helping people right now. And blessed is God who gave us seichel to create computers and Zoom and all sorts of tools like that to keep people together in an age like this. And blessed is blessed is God who gave people the ability to create majestic structures like the Williamsburg Bridge. I looked at my window, I saw it, and it's a fantastic structure, and with bicycle paths and everything else. And God gives people the ability to create structures like that. Creates the human brain.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. It's funny, I was also thinking of technology. Mine was blessed is he who gives us the means to stay connected and taught us to act in times of crisis. Blessed is he. And I was also looking at my computer and thinking of technology when I was thinking about how computers have been so important and technology has been so important during this pandemic. So very similar things we're picking up here, not surprisingly, in our own little Zoom bubble. So that was mine. If anyone else wants to present theirs, please.
So, blessed is the one who fills our hands with works of beauty and peace.
Amen. Thank you. Jeremy, please.
Yeah. Blessed is the one who created colors and sounds.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
I'll go.
Yeah.
Blessed is Hashem who creates fresh air and fills my lungs with breath.
That is a very powerful one.
Mine was very similar to Jeremy's. Blessed is Hashem who has given us ears to hear music and eyes to appreciate nature and art.
Oh, wow. Very similar, but also slightly different. Beautiful. No pressure, Michael. Do you want to share? Or?
I'm kind of shy.
Okay. No. Also, always welcome. Ellen? Paul? No? All right. So, please.
It's on mute. Okay, sorry. Mine was the beginning of Joel's. Blessed is Hashem who gave us the brain power to create vaccines to deal with things that everything is already here. It's a question of us taking the information and going the next step. So blessed is Hashem who gave us that amazing ability.
That's very beautiful. I also think it's really striking how basically almost all of us wrote Baruch She'amars or things of appreciation that God gave humanity either seichel for vaccines or the ability to appreciate art, or God gave humanity things. But I think it's actually very interesting that when you look at Baruch She'amar, It's totally the opposite. The first half is all just God is great and did these things, and the second half is humanity is great and did these things. But I think it's very interesting that our own lived experience, when we write our own Baruch She'amar, we can help it merge those two. God gave humanity the means to do these things, and I think that's a really powerful statement too, that our own Baruch She'amar is striving to combine the two halves into one merged whole. So hopefully in the future, as we say Baruch She'amar, we can incorporate our own, embrace the tradition. Baruch She'amar is a little bit more fluid than some of the other brachot, but also really take on this new meaning as we look at the bracha. So thank you everybody for sharing, and I'll see everybody next week.
I would just say that this conclusion sort of solves the problem of Baruch She'amar, because every traditional siddur starts off with some Kabbalistic introduction to the prayer that makes me believe it's a meditation. It's a private meditation before it becomes a mitzvah, a bracha shel mitzvah. So it's something that, and that's why the variety of the words of the stanzas, because it is so personal, and there are individual meditations that have come together to be codified.
Beautiful, exactly. So I think this is really one of the more practical takeaways we can have, that we all now have this opportunity to capitalize on this individual experience and really personalize our Baruch She'amar. And I won't tell on anybody if you say more than 87 words. It's okay. So everybody, feel free to reach out as always. Yeah, Jeff.
I just want to say another thing, that in the shtibel that I used to daven in before COVID, that people would really be very makbid on hefsek and dibur between these two parts. And what they would do is, if there was not enough, the shtibel next door, if if they needed people, they would come in and they would do sign language, and all this kind of sign language stuff that they would not utter. We need two people, all this kind of stuff, and they were really serious about it.
Monks.
Yeah, oftentimes you end up doing more of a mental hefsek by trying to avoid the verbal one. But
and people would laugh. I mean, some people would laugh. So I don't know what the purpose of not speaking was if they laughed.
That's a good point. But yeah, this is one of those areas that some people take the not speaking really strictly. Other people are a little bit more chill about it. I'll encourage Stanton to err on the side of caution, but whatever it is.
Thank you, Rabbi.
For sure.